Hey folks, well I had a request to do a video about a one-stick fire. The techniques, the tips, the tricks that I use to utilize one stick and break it down into enough pieces, including your tinder, to have a sustainable fire. So let's take a walk in the woods and I'll show you what I'm looking for. Alright, so I found a piece of standing dead aspen here, and what I'm looking for is, a decent sized piece of wood here that you can get some smaller sticks out of. You don't want it so small that you just end up with one little piece of kindling. It's about wrist diameter, but what's really important is that it's about an inch or so smaller than your knife. Okay, so when I beat this through this stick, I've got plenty of room to beat on the tip of my knife without making it super difficult. If I only had a half inch there, it'd be kind of a pain in the butt. I'm going to cut this piece approximately right there, and maybe down here, so I can always cut more off if I want. I want it about approximately wrist to elbow length. Before we get started with this project, let's talk a little bit about why we would ever want to do this. First of all, from my experience, this is just a very good teaching tool. This is a good way to get comfortable with your knife. It's a good way to understand batoning. It's a good way to understand why you would need a baton, and it allows you to create a fire, if you're successful, under less than ideal conditions. In other words, you don't have the perfect tinder. You have to make your own tinder by doing some very fine carving work in order to get the tinder to work with your ferro rod. Now, in real life, would you ever need to do this? Well, I can speak from experience that I did something very similar to this on Vancouver Island. The dead wood that I found was standing dead cedar for the most part, and the outside on a log about 8 inches in diameter, or 6 to 8 inches in diameter, the first 2 inches or so was completely rotten and completely rain soaked. So what I would do is I would go up to the standing dead wood and I would just use my fingers like claws or whatever and scrape most of that crap off, and then harvest that tree, and then so then the outer part is still wet, so then I would need to baton or somehow get inside of that piece of wood to get to the drier sections. The outer part of this wood is going to be wet. The inner part is going to be dry if you selected the correct piece of wood. Now, is it practical? Yes, like I said, I did something very similar to this on Vancouver Island. The only thing with this, though, I will say, is that with this size of piece of wood, you're not going to get enough material out of here to make one sustainable fire. You're going to need two. Now, if you have an axe, you can get a piece of wood this big, twice this big here, and carve off the outer sections, and then work on the inner sections, and probably you'll have enough for one sustainable fire. But in order to accommodate our blade, and there's really no hard and fast rules to this one stick fire, but the general consensus is you use your knife only, okay? So there's no way that I'd be able to take a big old piece, well, there is a way, but I wouldn't want to put my knife through this type of abuse. You wouldn't want a stick this big, okay? You just want it that big, like I discussed earlier about being able to baton through it. So in a real life situation, depending on the size of the log, I'm saying you're going to need two, but that's just my opinion. But anyway, we're just going to use one piece of wood, and a lot of folks too will shave the bark off, because I could have easily ran out into the woods and grabbed a piece of dead birch, say, or this aspen has some pretty nice tinder in it. I can see that right now. We're going to say for this exercise, and you can do it however you want, especially if you're just getting started, leave the bark on. But I'm going to say for this exercise, I'm not going to use the bark, because if I'm using the bark, why am I getting inside of the piece of wood? I'll just go gather some cattail fluff or something and have my tinder right then. So anyway, let me shave this down, get all the bark off it, and we'll get going. Okay, I've debarked this piece of wood here, and I've said this in many other videos, but you can test to see if this piece of wood is actually dry by putting it on your bare skin. Put it somewhere where you're sensitive, like the inside of your arm, your face, whatever, and see if it feels warm or if it feels cold. It should feel pretty warm. Now this does feel a little bit cool on my arm, but the inside feels basically like outside temperature. If it's wet, it'll feel pretty darn cold on your skin, and you can even feel the moisture in it. Okay, next is I don't really want to just start beating my knife with no anvil or backstop. But I don't have one, but I have this other piece of wood. So I'm going to try to make an anvil out of this piece of wood real quick. And I'm just going to grab my baton. Don't want to do that on my tarp because it'll probably drive it right into the ground. And I'm going to just try and create an anvil out of this piece of wood. I'm trying to avoid driving my knife into the ground. That would work for an anvil, but since how I got this here. Okay, so now I've got my anvil here, so to speak. And if this were Vancouver Island or whatever, what I would do would be basically the exact opposite of how I baton this. If I'm out in the woods, the last thing I want to do is go right straight dead center across a piece of wood so that all the force or all the meat is across the blade. In other words, it's too taxing on it. Why not cut little pieces of the pie off? So I wouldn't have cut through it like this. I would have started shaving little pieces of the pie off. The problem with doing that with a soft wood like this, and that's another thing, you definitely want to try and get a soft wood if you can. But the problem with that is it will, especially if it's a little bit rotten on the outside, it will flake off in like little punky type sections. So, which is definitely not what you want to do if you're trying to practice this skill. But if I were doing this, like I said, in real life, and I really needed a fire, I would cut sections of this off. Okay, and then I would be left with some of this outer wood here, but also this heartwood inside there, and just carve off all the moisture laden wood. But I'm not going to go right dead center. I'm going to go off the side a little bit. That actually split real nice. So I'm just going to do that again. Just taking little pieces of the pie off. If your knife can't handle this task, it's my recommendation you get a new knife. All the things that we practice, all the things that we learn, all the little tips and tricks, you want to try and remember them as much as you can. One thing I'm doing here is I'm not allowing my dry wood to touch the damp grass. Now, what I want to do, so I finally gotten to the center of the piece of wood here. This, in theory, which holds true in my experience, is that this is going to be the driest piece of wood that you can find. So, if it's the driest piece of wood out of that one stick, that's what I want to try to get on fire first. I'm going to set that aside. I want to start getting my tinder processed first. Whenever I do a fire, that's always the first thing that I do, unless it's like absolute perfect conditions. I always try to gather my tinder first, because if it's at all moist, I can set it off to the side after I've processed it, worked it up, got a lot of surface area to it. I can set it off to the side, or maybe on a tree limb, or somewhere in the sun, on a tree limb in the wind, something like that, and that will help dry it out while I'm processing this other stuff, making kindling and stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and make a fuzz stick out of this. Now, a fuzz stick is just different than a feather stick, is because you're not using the blade of the knife, so these little curls would be feathers. I'm going to try to use the back of the knife and create fuzz. One thing I have noticed is that sometimes I have difficulty doing it, but let's see, and this isn't exactly perfect, but this isn't working too bad. What did I do here? I started on an edge. I didn't start on the flat part of the stick. I started on an edge. That's the same thing you want to do when you feather stick. You always want to be shaving edges down. Every time you shave an edge down, you create a flat or a semi-flat round right here. See, I shaved that edge off. You can see there's the edge. There's where I shaved it down. So now this is round and smooth. So what I'll do is just make a couple feathers in that spot. And now, with those two feathers out of the way, I've created two ridges, one on each side of that. So then I can gather my knife back up again and try to work on those edges. So this is some of my tinder right here. I'm going to set that off to the side. That's about as much screwing around as I want to do with making a fuzz stick. So long as I have, I don't know, golf ball size piece of group of shavings, I should be able to get that to spark up. Now I'm going to continue and make feather sticks out of these bigger pieces, or out of these other pieces. Trying to let the knife do most of the work. Sometimes when you have a nice sharp edge like that, it wants to take off quite a bit. I don't care if the shavings stay on the stick. I actually prefer when they don't stay on the stick, unless it's extremely windy. Now I'm going to move on to the next stage, which is a little bit thicker feathers. We got a pretty good start here with our, you might say this is our tinder, our smalls, and then our next step up. These are quite a bit smaller than smalls or pencil lead diameter type pieces of wood, but you need them that small in order to catch, because you're not using any tinder, so you definitely need them pretty small. So I'm just going to be, it's real important that when you start batoning little tiny pieces of wood like this, if I'm forcing this blade into this piece of wood, I don't have my hand underneath it. Okay, I forced it in there just to kind of get it started. See, I don't even need a baton. I can just kind of slice it like, or slice down like that. I'm barely touching that piece of wood right there. I'm just going to baton gently down. And if you're not comfortable with that method, another method that I'll use once in a while is kind of like a side chopping method. Then I've got a nice split in it. I can just put the blade gently into that slit and then push it down. This particular task or skill really involves a lot of knife safety, a lot of control of your knife. One thing I've seen people do before too is they'll get their hand under here. Maybe they've got their knife stuck in a large piece of wood, the one they just started with, and they'll get it like this and they'll start working this blade back and forth like this, trying to get their knife out. Well, I mean, you can see it's just a hinge with your hand underneath, so definitely don't do that. In order to be a sustainable fire, the general guideline is to make sure that you have sticks on fire approximately the size of your thumb. Because if you get those sticks on fire, that will give you a chance to go out and harvest other wood, and your fire, when you come back, it won't be dead. You can leave it alone for 5 minutes or so. You wouldn't want to leave it alone for more than that. And that's, I wouldn't do that anyway, but that's what when folks talk about a sustainable fire, that's what they're talking about. Me personally, I like to have all my fuel gathered before I try to start a fire. So these 3 pieces of wood right here, this is my goal, is to get these on fire. If I get my tinder to ignite, but not my shavings or not my next step up, it really didn't accomplish the task. Or if I only made shavings out of the whole stick, it really didn't accomplish the task. I want to be able to go ahead and get a nice fire going that can ignite maybe questionable wood, maybe not damp or anything like that, but just slightly moist, and then work your way to the worst fuels after that. Try and fluff it up a little bit. Maybe get some of these other bigger pieces out of there. Ah, what the heck, I'll throw them in there. Now, once again, this goes back to our two methods of using our ferro rod. If I was just trying to light this little bit on fire, I would plant my ferro rod right here and strike along the surface because I'm going for a really small area. If I had this huge pile, then I would use the pullback method. I think I got melted duct tape on my ferro rod. Alright, so let's see if we can get this on fire real quick. Okay, so we succeeded in getting that on fire. Oh, just for a second. Get my tarp out of the way, take a second, put my ferro rod away. Ideally, the base for this fire would be quite a bit bigger than what it is now. It's pretty unstable. That's why all my shavings went off to the side all willy-nilly. I like to angle my sticks up in a triangle or pyramid type fashion. I don't care for the log fire lay so much, especially when I'm working with not the best materials. I like to get it up and create its own chimney. Get all that surface area exposed to the flames. I can start working on my bigger pieces. Utilize the wind, put it up downwind side. I've used this method before on Vancouver Island. I've practiced it quite a bit. Like I said before though, personally, with a stick that size, you would need at least, for me, a couple of them to get a sustainable fire going, because the outside of the piece of wood is going to be wet. That's why you're getting to the center of the piece of wood. Either that or the outside is maybe just damp enough to where it's going to be a pain to catch it with a ferro rod spark, but you get to the inside and you make that fuzz stick or those really fine shavings, and then you can add that slightly moist wood to the outside of that, and then it'll catch. Anyway, hope you liked the video, folks. Take care.